We're broadcasting now, Philip.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Should we go ahead and dive in?
Please do.
Okay, super. Well, greetings, everyone, and it will be fun to see you here a bit more in just a couple of minutes and to have some dialogue here. But my name is Philip Ackerman Leist. I am the Dean of the School of the New American Farmstead at Sterling College, and have been teaching sustainable organic agriculture now for the past almost 3 decades, I guess. Part of the start, as you'll see here as I jump in, was really in Italy. So if you'll bear with me, I've got the presentation to show you here for about 20 minutes to tell you a bit of a story of a town in the Alto Adige in the Südtirol region, which is the town of Malz in German, and it's called Malles Fenosta in Italian. So I'll dive right in here. And I'm speaking to you from Vermont today, which is where I live. I lived here in the Alto Adige for about 4 years and have been going there since 1983. So it's a place that's near and dear to my heart. And this is the project that you can find us online if you'd like to see more of what we've done, and almost all of the images that I'm sharing with you here in the next couple of minutes. You can find, plus some others, on the topplinggoliath.org website. If you go to topplinggoliath.com, you'll end up at a really wonderful brewery in Iowa. But if you dive into topplinggoliath.org, then you'll find us here and find this entire project. So I want to acknowledge a couple of my collaborators here. One is Douglas Gayton, who is the multimedia artist who is just extraordinary in helping me put together these images and the entire Toppling Goliath website and project. And then the Italian who you'll see in the middle, actually, it's interesting. He shares some of the things that you all have in common. He's actually Italian, but he's living now in England. His name is Pier Provenzano. He's a filmmaker. You can look him up. ididthisfilm.com is his website. And he's the more Italian-looking person. And there to the right, you'll see Mickey de Rackevilts is someone that I've known now, well, ever since he was 6 months old. And he's been a translator who's working with us and really helping us to figure out how to present this story from the South Tyrolean perspective, because that's where he's grown up. So, Douglas is a California filmmaker, multimedia artist. You can look him up on the Lexicon of Sustainability, doing a project now for the FAO on forgotten foods, and is a really fascinating person to work with. And I think in the kinds of discussions that you all are probably having there are a couple of things that are really interesting to take away from Douglas's work. And one is that he says, whenever you've got a project like this and you go in, you need to make sure that you have no information waste. You're going in to try to gather the story somewhere internationally, perhaps, and you need to, just like you're making sure that you're careful about food waste, you want to make sure that you don't have information waste. And so this is Douglas here, and with Pierre. And part of what Douglas also notes is that we should all be platform agnostic as we're trying to tell our stories. And clearly, we really haven't won the story wars in terms of sustainable food, organic food, and farming. And we just have to be platform agnostic so that we can get to multiple audiences, sometimes by way of art shows, sometimes by way of food, as you all seem to be doing there, other times by way of websites, also filmmaking, whatever it takes in order to get the message across. So Douglas has been a great mentor for me here in this whole project. And this is me actually in the vineyard in the Alto Adige, where I first went and worked in 1983. But this is me back in the early 1990s. I ended up managing this particular vineyard, which is associated with Brunenberg Castle. This is a place in the Alto Adige near Tirolo di Merano. You can see part of the city of Merano down below. And what I was doing there was managing the farm. And as it turned out, the farmer who was there when I started to go back to work in the 1990s actually ended up, unfortunately, dying suddenly. And so I ended up taking over the management of the entire farm. And part of what I was doing in the process was obviously spraying the pesticides in the vineyard. And that was not my most favorite part of the process. And I think I was the only person in the entire village who tended to use a respirator, one of the only folks who tended to wear a rubber suit when I was doing the work. And it was about an 8-hour job to spray the entire vineyards. And ultimately, that was one of the things that after 3 summers of that, I really decided that was enough and needed to come back to the States to see if I could pick up more on organic agriculture and different possibilities there. But I will say, I think perennial fruits of all of agriculture, perennial fruits are probably the most difficult in many ways to do the organic management. But we are making strides forward, which I'll tell you about more as we go. So this is Brunenburg Castle. Again, a lot of parallels to what you all are doing. They have obviously a working vineyard, working farm, which is now run by one of the sons, and it's also the former home of the American poet Ezra Pound. His family still lives there, and a really fascinating place because it also houses an agricultural museum of alpine foodways. So this gives you a little perspective, and what you can see there with the turret of the castle is the convergence of 2 slopes coming together. And that is the point actually at which the Finchgau Valley begins, or the Val Venosta in Italian. And that really in many ways is where the story begins here that I'll share with you in brief. So many of you know the Alto Adige, the South Tyrol region, and the story really happens in the Finchgau Valley. And it's interesting because that's the valley where the apple growers have moved in more and more over the years. And certainly since being there since 1993, that's part of what I've observed throughout time is the movement of the apples. And as it turns out, climate change has also meant that apples now can be in places where they ordinarily might not be. And I'll give you a little bit of perspective on that here. So the apple industry, certainly we know it goes back to the Middle Ages. That's when we think the apple came in by way of Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan. And so here you can actually see apples that are being harvested actually in the little village right below the castle, right below the vineyard where I was working. So it was an industry that was burgeoning, and the apple cooperatives became stronger and stronger over time. And the South Tyrolean apples were very famous because with 300 days of sunshine, with cool nights, ample water, it really is the perfect place for growing apples. But I think we also don't think very often about the use of pesticides and how far back that goes. This is also a photo that was taken down below the castle in the same village of Algunt. And what they're probably spraying here is a dormant oil, which you may see in your parts of the world. And that dormant white oil, vice oil, is a petroleum-based product typically used for aphids or tree lice. And so they have the ox there with the pressure barrel. And if you want to, afterwards, we can get into a whole discussion really about how pesticides started to come into all of Europe. And it was really by way of an American invasion with grapevines. But we'll hold off on that and go there if you like afterwards. So this is what the village where I first went to in 1983, this is what it looks like now. It's been completely taken over, I would say, in many ways by apples. You know, the hay fields have been sacrificed for apples. Just about anywhere you look, you see these apples. And, you know, at first blush, if you will, pun intended, I guess, you know, they are really extraordinary, beautiful apples, and just indicative of the fact this is a great place to grow apples. It's also a great place to have diversified agriculture, but that's part of the story too. And this is the trellis system that was picked up by the South Tyrolean apple growers in the 1970s. They heard about what the Dutch were doing, Dutch being so progressive in many ways in terms of agriculture. So they went and they picked up on this slender tree trellis system, which you see here, which is really taken off throughout the world at this point. And so the slender tree trellis system, it certainly helps in terms of efficiency. The trellis means that you can actually have the apples, the apple trees be totally full of apples. They're easier to prune, they're easier to spray, they're easier to harvest. So there's a real advantage. And when you get the system, not only do you have a change in what's happening in terms of the monocultures that are starting to step in, but what you can also see here are the hail nets. And the hail nets, there is an advantage, certainly in protection from hail, which is a big issue in the alpine world. But also it prevents sun scald, prevents some of the bird damage. And so there are advantages, and it saves the farmers on crop insurance. And yet it's also a pretty significant change in the landscape, as you can start to imagine. So this is what it looks like from a side view. This is the harvest that's going on of some of the apples. This is late August. And part of the story here is the fact that the cooperatives were so incredibly successful there in the United States. I'm sorry, that they were so successful there in the South Tyrol region that suddenly you found out the farmers realized what kinds of profits they could make. So on 1 hectare, very often the farmers are netting 25 to 40,000 euros, which is really extraordinary. And then the fact that they're not having to pay income tax on that makes it even more extraordinary. So, highly lucrative. So, that displaces the wine industry. It certainly displaces the livestock farmers. And it also means that these farmers have a lot of cash in the bank and are able to go in and purchase lands in places where the land values perhaps are less and where apples have not been traditionally grown, which is the case in the Val Venosta in the Finchgau Valley. So these farmers were, as we say in the States, they were making bank, and as they were doing so, they were able to invest those profits by buying land in some of the upper reaches of the Val Venosta, where suddenly they were finding with climate change they could actually grow apples. And this is also the place just above the valley is where the Iceman was found, Ötzi as he's known in German. And that discovery really is pretty extraordinary, because not only did we find this perfectly preserved cadaver, we also had the clothing, we had the tools, and not only that, we were also able to discern what he was eating by virtue of what we found on him and then also in him. And in him were 5 of the traditional grains that are still grown in this area. The Val Venosta, the Finchgau Valley, was known as the breadbasket of the Tyrol region. So in fact, the royal family in England highly coveted the grains that were grown in this region, and into the late 1800s, early 1900s, actually brought their grains in. The Vatican also brought in the grains from the South Tyrol region. And so, when we think about apples, not only are they displacing, all of these other things, they've also been displacing these traditional grain growers who've been there in the area. But the Iceman is fascinating because we find that he came from a dairy culture. He seems to be seemed to have been somewhat lactose intolerant. He had 5 of these grains. Let's see if I can remember them: einkorn, spelt, immer, millet, and I'm missing one, and maybe I'll remember it here when we come back to it. Yeah, so he was found here in the Val Venosta, just on the northern flank of the Val Venosta. And so that really gives us this indication that here we've got over 5,000 years of documented food history, that really is being threatened by a monoculture that's starting to step in and take over. So this is the town of Maltz, and when I say the municipality of Maltz, what I mean are the 11 villages that comprise it. Gosh, I'm sorry, in square miles, and I'm not remembering in kilometers, it's about 92, 93 square miles. It's a magnificent spot. It's where Switzerland, which you see there to the left, those ranges are in Graubünden. And so it's where Switzerland, Austria, and Italy all converge. So it's an area that has really been known for a long time to be a place where cultures converge, sometimes clash, and in this case, actually, different agrarian traditions have clashed as well. So this gives you a little bit of perspective. And what you're seeing here in front of you is the main town of Maltz. And so this is Maltz back in I believe this one was in the 1950s. Gives you a sense of the traditional grains that were being grown there. Actually, some potatoes in the forefront, and just magnificent architecture as well as these frescoes that go back to the 9th century and forward. So really a wonderful place to visit if you get the chance. And this is a photo from the 1970s of Maltz. Gives you a sense of the grain fields that are still there, still intact. And many of those grain fields were rye as well as spelt, and then in some cases einkorn and emmer as well. And you get a sense just of the history with all of the terracing here, of the fact that farmers here have certainly been sustainable for a period of going back to 800, 900 AD, and just the fact they've been able to manage those places is really extraordinary, especially for Americans that don't have that sense of history. And this gives you another perspective on Maltz. This was taken, I think I took this 4 summers ago, and those dark green splotches that you can see, those are actually the apple, the apple orchards that are starting to move in. What you will note here is that you've got these small parcel sizes. So because this area had these invasions coming from different areas very often, they had these nucleated settlements with the farm fields spread outside. And so those would range from anything from 1 hectare to, well, 1/10 of a hectare up to 2 hectares in general. And now I'll show you just a bit here. This gives you an aerial view of Maltz. This is one of the villages, Plevin, which is a really beautiful spot. This village actually burned to the ground back in the 1980s because the buildings are so tightly packed together, but they've rebuilt it. You'll see here the highest Benedictine monastery in all of Europe. This is the central part of Maltz, of the village. This is the agricultural school. That's also the Benedictine monastery with the highest vineyards in all of Europe, which are biodynamically managed. Gives you a little more perspective. And the highest, here you see these lakes actually that are up at 2,000 meters and above. There have been pesticide residues that have been found there from spraying of apples and actually some of the vineyards as well. One of the guest houses. And you all are more familiar with transhumance than Americans tend to be, so you get a good sense of the high pastures. And that's the Ortler in the background. Here there are some cherry orchards that have moved in along with the apples. Start to get a sense here of the apple orchards starting to move into Maltz along with the pesticides. This hill that you see, whoops, you'll see it again, but it's in the center now. That was a Neolithic cultic site. There it is. And of course, the church on top. And the grains here were grown up to an elevation of 1,700 meters. There you can get a view of the Ortler with its glacier. Some of the high shepherd's huts. And the Ortler is at 3,900 meters. And there we go. So, thanks to Red Bull for some reason. So just to give you a little more geographical perspective there, so Maltz is right at the confluence, up in that upper corner, right where the V on Val is, and that's the location of Maltz. And this is what's happening in the central part of that valley. These are the pesticides being sprayed in an apple orchard in this case. And what is interesting is that these folks started an organic herb farm right there in the central part of the valley before the apples really started to dominate. And they had organic herbs, and they had decided that that's what they wanted to do instead of apples. So they took out all of their apple trees and then put this organic herb business in place. But what happened was they found themselves surrounded by apple growers all around them. And as a result, they ended up having to put up these high tunnels to cover the entire operation. The pesticide residues are so heavy that the water that's shed from those structures has to be put elsewhere, so that because they'll have their organic certification denied as a result. So they were sort of the canary in the coal mine for the people of Maltz. And this gives you a little bit of sense of what the pesticide spraying actually looks like there. So, part of what we've done with pesticides is we've reduced the size of the droplets. And so those droplets actually are able to rise even further to the point that they are finding those pesticide residues at above 2,000 meters. And this particular valley, the Val Venosta, actually has a wind that in German, the Tyrolean dialect, is called the Finchgewind. And the Finchgewind is named because it will blow sometimes for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. So between these small droplets for pesticide applications, the fact that you have the thermal updrafting, and then the fact that you also have the Finchgewind blowing 2 to 3 weeks at a time, pesticides create a lot of issues, and you can't keep them in one place. That's pretty clear. So this is a farmer in malts, an organic dairy farmer. He's the first one who really faced the onslaught of the pesticides that were coming by way of apples. You can see a little bit on the left-hand side and perhaps on the right. Apple orchards started to move in the late 1990s, or I'm sorry, in about 2009, I believe it was. And as a result, he had to have his hay tested to see whether there were any pesticide residues. And all of the samples that he took in the first cut of hay, the second cut of hay, and the third cut of hay, in the first summer that he did the testing, all of those samples came back positive for pesticide residues, multiple pesticide residues. And so it really put him into quite a bind. And so this was an area that was really trying to be more and more sustainable, market everything that they were doing, or a lot of what they were doing, based on being organic. And so they had the Panorama Hotel, which is one of the first organic hotels. It was the first in this region, one of the earlier ones in all of Italy. To the right there, you have Beatrice, who is a hairdresser. She now has an organic hairdressing salon. To the bottom left there, you'll see the breads, the traditional parle as they're known, that have been grown there. And then to the right, it just gives you a little bit of a sense. That's the first whiskey distillery in all of Italy, utilizing the grains that were in this region. So here these folks were trying to build out this green economy and suddenly find themselves being faced with more and more apple orchards coming in and all of the associated pesticide residues. And so this is the mayor of Maltz. This is Uli, as he's known around town, or Ulrich. And he is the person that the farmer, the dairy farmer, first went to say, listen, I've got an issue here, and we need to do something in order to tackle the whole pesticide issue. And so Uli has been really extraordinary in all that he's done. And we can go into more detail if you like, but essentially, Uli stepped into the game and said that he would try to figure out ways in which, utilizing some of the things that were present in Italy before with legislation, that he would try to find the best case examples that he could and create some sort of legislation that might provide the opportunity to stop the apple orchards, or at least stop the pesticide spraying. And this is Conrad. Conrad was someone who was beginning to pull together a lot of these grain producers to bring back the old varieties of grains that were traditionally grown in the area. And so he became someone who really was sort of recreating the social economy of the area by virtue of his own interest. And this is his own kitchen where you can go and have a meal, and then you can talk about the price after you've finished and decide together on what it should be. And there were folks like these two, Edith and her husband, and they were Robert, is his name. And so they were beginning to grow, or they had been for about a decade, growing out all of these different varieties of grains that were the older varieties, as you see here, trying to maintain those, trying to bring those back so that people were using the older varieties. And then you have folks like Edward and Helga, who were doing as much as they could of producing their own grains, their own breads, also teaching school children, and then also tourists, and then also other farmers how to grow these old grains, as some of the traditions had slipped by. And then you've got the bakers, such as Franz here, who's baking Schüttelbrot, which I don't know if you've seen at any point, but it's this sourdough rye that is flat and crispy. It's just magnificent. And you can see there's a tub, which is just to the left there. That's the sourdough. And that tub of sourdough, that batch is older than he is. But he's someone who wanted to make sure that there was the supply of these grains. And so it was really the diversity of the landscape provided the diversity of the plate. And that was part of what they were trying to get across. And you have Aegidius here, who is someone I wish I'd met 30, 40 years ago. Aegidius was a conventional apple farmer, and then decided that he was going to give up all pesticides and even give up compost, and started working on his own orchard, which now is totally, it's not organic certified, it's biodynamic certified, and he sprays nothing. And so he plants at about half the density of everyone else. And as a result, he has more wildlife, and he also has less disease pressure or pest pressure. So really an extraordinary grower who, again, was finding himself surrounded on all sides by conventional growers. And you've got people like Peter here, who is the town veterinarian. who was the one who was watching the landscape change really dramatically and is a seminal figure in all of this battle, to hold off on the apple growers as they were starting to move in and take over, because he felt like they were also displacing the livestock agriculture that we know goes back to the time of the Iceman and even before that. And you've got folks like this fellow who is a really interesting, one of the most famous cheesemakers in all of Italy, Alexander Agatle, who again, everything there that he was doing was based on having grass that was totally pesticide free, that was organic. And he actually wanted to print his own currency. He went to the Italian tax authorities because he needed I believe he needed just over 200,000 euros to build a cheese cave. Making cheese was the only way that he could decide that he was going to be able to make it financially. And so he printed his own currency with the blessing of the tax authorities, and sold those, so that an Engelhorn, as it's known, his farm is the Engelhorn, and you can see the little emblem there, which is in the middle of his cheese. And so one Engelhorn was the equivalent of 1 kilo of cheese. And so you could buy the Engelhorn, and when you bought the Engelhorn, you would buy 10 years in advance of cheese. A really extraordinary guy who also has found pesticide residues in his hay over the course of the last year, unfortunately. And what we're trying to show here is the fact that, as we have tried to move toward what you're probably familiar with as IPM, Integrated Pest Management, Integrierte Obstbau, as they know it in German. But the problem is we have so many different pesticides that are coming in. You may have, for some of these apple orchards, you may have 35 to 40 different pesticides that are sprayed during the course of a year. And it's in such high amounts that 1 hectare, you may have up to 42 kilograms of pesticides that are sprayed on 1 hectare in a given year. And so the maltsters, the people of malts, were really relying upon the precautionary principle, which is something that you all pay more attention to in Europe than we do here in the States. And it really is this question of who is it that carries the burden? Should the burden in terms of safety, should that be on the shoulders of citizens and consumers, or should it be on the shoulders of the manufacturers? Folks like myself certainly think that that burden of proof should be on the shoulders of the manufacturers before these things are released. But this is a really critical piece for the maltsters as they pushed forward their whole initiative. So in 2014, there were a couple of folks who came together and worked with the mayor of Maltz, with Ulrich. Started working with him to develop. First of all, there was a manifesto, which you all do so well in Italy, and there was a manifesto calling for a pesticide-free future. And then in 2014, there was a public referendum that went from, I believe it was August 24th until September 6th, something like that, in 2014. And that public referendum called for a pesticide-free future. And so Johannes here is the apotheca. He's the pharmacist in town. He got together with the pediatrician in town, and they really promoted this idea as much as they could. And so it manifested itself in the public referendum, which was approved at an approval rate of about 3/4 of the population approved this call for a pesticide-free future. And so it was really extraordinary. And it was the first time that we have been able to find anywhere in the world where there's been a public referendum calling for a pesticide-free future. And that really is of all synthetic pesticides. And you feel free to look this up. You can find it on the topplinggoliath.org site. You can see the manifesto, which was written really brilliantly by the people of Maltz. And it was the women who were the real game changers, because the men weren't really changing the conversation. But some of the women got together and decided that they needed to do more of a campaign to promote this idea for a pesticide-free future. They came together. They did a letter writing campaign, which was very effective in starting to get the word out. They also did this really interesting thing where they took the Tyvek suits, stuffed them with hay in the middle of the night, and then for every pesticide that was being used with the apples, they taped them on, and they, under the cover of darkness, they put these around the public marketplace where the farmers market appeared the next day. And that also made a big impact. And then they had a banner campaign in which several hundred banners ended up being unfurled in the middle of the night throughout all of the 11 villages. Some of them, like this one, are still up. And here, putting them on the guest houses and linking, they weren't just focused on agriculture, but they were linking it to the safety of their guests as well, with the agritourism being about 1/4 of the income of the economy of the South Tyrol region. And even the abbot joined in, and Pope Francis was a key element of that in his encyclical on the environment. And so the abbot actually decided that they needed to have their own wine. It needed to be organic. And so he brought in actually a Belgian who did the planting of these, which are now the highest vineyards in all of Europe, and some of the most amazing organically managed vineyards that you'll find anywhere. So just to give you a little sense, this was they were also using the aesthetics as much as they could in putting forward this whole idea, trying to convey this notion. And you can see the Finchgewint up there at the very top. So trying to make sure people realize the dangers of pesticide drift. And the sunflower became the emblem of everything that they did. So these appeared during that 2-week referendum all over town. Sunflowers were there everywhere. And so in 2018, they put forward these ordinances. And right now, this is an interesting thing for you to follow, because these ordinances are actually in court in the South Tyrol. They will be coming to Rome probably. And then if the town is denied, then they will take their case to the EU. And Johannes, the pharmacist, has several ideas that he thinks are really important for people. We have this on our website, and you can check it out. And so he has these ideas of how they were successful in Malta, of getting to the point of putting forward these particular ordinances. But what's happened since then is, and some of you have seen this, I'm sure, there's sort of become this really fascinating network all across Europe for pesticide-free towns. And so PAN-EU, the Pesticide Action Network EU, has been really seminal in pushing forward this initiative that really is having a significant impact. And so we were in Brussels 2 Junes ago, last June, June 2018, and just to actually see this go across the screen in the EU was really fairly astounding. Wish we would see more things like this in the United States. But this discussion with the EU about the future of Malta and other towns that wanted to be pesticide-free, or still do want to be pesticide-free. And so this was at the EU as well. And we took our artworks, again, Douglas's idea of platform agnostic, trying to get these art displays and other messages across as much as we can, wherever we can. Switzerland, as you may know, now there's the push forward to see if they can have a referendum to do a 10-year transition to a pesticide-free future. We'll see where that goes. You know, certainly we're starting to see what's happening out there more and more in the news, the whole issue of glyphosate in particular, and then also neonicotinoids. So, you know, there's momentum, which I think is really extraordinary. And we're also realizing that there's this tragic and, you know, really disturbing crash in terms of insects throughout the world. And it really was German amateurs who helped us kind of latch on to exactly what's happening there. This is a story from the New York Times, which you may like to pursue. And then certainly in France, as a result of the insect declines and also some of the pesticides, there are these collapses of bird populations around the world as well. So we're starting to take note, and things are showing up in the media more and more. And certainly with the FAO coming out, or the UN coming out recently, talking about the biodiversity collapse, you know, that also has made headlines that have been very, very helpful in pushing this whole thing forward. And it is catching on. There's momentum here in the United States as well. There's a group started by one mother who really started this in non-toxic neighborhoods. This is spreading across the United States of eliminating synthetic pesticides in public places all around the United States, which is pretty extraordinary. And just recently, a study came out. This is someone who's become my friend lately here, Koen Hertoge, who lives in Malta. And he decided that they needed to test pesticide drift and actually see what was happening with pesticide drift on public playgrounds throughout the South Tyrol. And so this was just published in a peer-reviewed journal, which is really extraordinary for citizen science. And I think a message to all of us that, we all have the capacity to move these things forward, to advance the topics, and even engage in citizen science, which is really critical. And this was the initial part of their study, which has now been published. And Vandana Shiva picked up on what was happening there and invited Ulrich and myself to come over. And so she felt that they needed to find a way to bring together the people of the Himalayas, the people of the Alps, and now the people of North America as well, to really push for, by 2030, this pesticide-free future. And we just had Vandana here a couple of weeks ago in Vermont. You can see her in the center there. So we did a Northeast Earth journey where we were going around pushing for this 2030 campaign for a pesticide-free future. This is on the state capital of Montpelier, Vermont. And I'll just wrap up here. This is Nick, who is to the right, Nick Therakovils. And Nick was the young lad of 5, 6, and 7 who was out helping me in the vineyards when I was at Brunanburg back in the early 90s. He's taken over the vineyards at Brunanburg Castle now. And he's gotten to the point with the fungal resistant varieties that he's put in that everything there is, it's not only organic, he also doesn't even use copper or sulfur in the spraying. And he started off with about 17 different varieties that he was using for growing grapes. And now he's down, I think the last count that I heard was 13. I'm going back in just a couple of weeks to see what he's doing. But really an extraordinary viticulturalist, and the wines that he's making, they're really, he's starting to figure it out. He's always made great wines, but he's having to do it with these new varieties. And it's really pretty extraordinary to see what he's done. So we'll wrap up there. Great.
Philip, well, yeah, we've got the microphone. Philip, that was fantastic. We were clapping, but I didn't have the microphone on, so you probably didn't hear us. But
oh, well, thank you. Oh. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, it took a little longer. I'm sorry. That's it.
As a winemaker, I've got a question or two. Potentino is very interesting because it's surrounded by a valley that really got abandoned, even though there was probably some very early use of sulfur spraying in the 1920s. Since then, it's really not had any use of chemicals. It got abandoned and it's all been farmed. Really, there's small plots of land. We have no monoculture here. We've got mixed fruit trees with olives and vines, and we have the most fantastic biodiversity. So it's very special, quite difficult to protect. We're always under attack. And so it's very encouraging to see this citizen-based movement. I can't really see it happening here. But the thing that I wanted to ask you was, there's a new theory that biodiversity creates situations where we have less fungal problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are, for example, the attack on the olive trees down in the south, the Xylella, which is moving across Italy and Europe, devastating olive trees. There's a new theory that this actually is coming from an imbalance in biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that has occurred up in the Mals region as a result of reducing monoculture and using less pesticides?
Right. My response, and it'd be interesting to get some of my malts colleagues' response too, but mine would be that it's related to two different things. One is the biodiversity, and I think Egidius Vellenzon, who is the orchardist that I mentioned there, that I wish I'd met 30 or 40 years ago, he's totally about the biodiversity, but also the second piece is the soil health. And I think we're realizing more and more now that both the monocultural applications and then also the use of things like glyphosate, the impact on soil health is actually enormous. And so, I think it's really important to look back actually at someone, a good British stock, Sir Albert Howard. Some of you may know his book, The Agricultural Testament. And Agricultural Testament traveled throughout Asia and just did this extraordinary job in the late 1800s, early 1900s in looking at soil health and looking in India, China. I don't remember if he made it to Japan or not, but that soil health piece was really critical. And certainly from the perspective of Aegidius, and part of what Aegidius does that I'll just give you a brief synopsis with his orchard management that I think is amazing. He only takes a tractor twice a year into his orchard. And one time is to mow straight down the rows. And so he'll mow down the rows, and then he takes a scythe handle. He takes the scythe, the blade itself off, turns it upside down, and he actually uses the inverted scythe handle to break the weeds in between the trees. And because part of what he's trying to do is promote insect diversity and also the birds and the other arthropods that are there as well. So, just what I saw with his fruit quality in terms of what he's done with soil health and biodiversity, I've never seen anything like it. So I would say yes, from what I've seen.
Philip, you're still screen sharing, by the way.
Oops. Okay.
No problem. Just nice to see you. Another question at this end? You want to carry that on?
Philip, I'd also like to ask, from an economic point of view, the effect on the price of the product, whether people in Marles are able to sell a product that potentially is more expensive, and whether its costs are much higher for production.
Right. I think that organic premium is a huge question, Charlotte, and a really critical one. In malts right now, and talking to Aegidius, he at one point was receiving almost double for his product. And that was also the case for a lot of the organic farmers in the area. And now they're down to about a 20-25% premium. But people do seem to be willing to pay that. That 20 to 25% seems to be about appropriate. And one of the very first things that they did with those ordinances when they put those in place was to require that the schools utilize organic food. And, sort of true to science, they actually started with the kindergarten because those are the most sensitive children. So they've converted their schools now to utilizing organic produce as well, which has helped to build the marketplace out. So there does seem to be a willingness to invest in organic, from the people in malts. I mean, now they're very much gathered around it, with about 3/4 of the population being so vested in this whole initiative.
So we've got lots of social innovators here, social change activists here. And
Great.
I think it's very interesting that Marles managed to create a community that empowered itself to go pesticide free. What do you think is one of the main contributors to that?
First answer would be women. And I think I see this really all around the world, that the way I attribute it is that women are so much more attuned, I think, to nature, nurture, and nutrition, which shame on us men, for not paying more attention. But I think, so often the women have been the ones who've been paying attention and have moved that forward. But I think also that what malts did so well in those early stages, they spent about 2 years bringing in different people from all around Europe, so doctors, lawyers, toxicologists, bringing in those people so that they had about 2 years worth of discussions, about all the advantages of moving toward a pesticide-free future. And so those were public forums. Everyone was invited. It was always free or having some sort of donation. And I think that was a huge piece of it, that the dialogue went on for long enough that they got to the point where there was reasonable consensus, not perfect consensus. There is still some strife there, to be sure. But I think once people were armed with the science, that made an enormous difference. And so I think the science is a really critical piece.
Well, Philip, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to move on with our program now, because we've got some cheese making to do, actually. Our lovely cheese makers are here, and they're going to show us how cheese is made, because I always think it's quite magical. Nobody realized how simple it is. So we're hoping that the Masai Mara, the Maasai, are going to be hosting Lorenzo and Francesca so that they're taught how to make cheese in the future.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So Philip, listen, what we're going to do, I'm going to put you in touch with everyone who's spoken and send you some of the presentations, because we've had quite a range of discussions, a lot of very depressing ones. So actually, to end on such a lovely note really is great, because it's a very positive view, and it's been a successful campaign. So actually, thank you. Now we're going to go and eat cheese, which is also a happy thing to do. So Philip, when you're next in Italy, please do come and visit.
Great, I'd love to. Yeah, and hope folks will also go visit Maltz when you get a chance. It's an amazing
I'm going
place.
up there.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Great, thank you all. Congratulations on putting this together.
Ciao, ciao.
Great. Ciao.